Hello and welcome to another Office 365 Hours. My name is Christian Buckley. I'm the Brand Alliance Director here at AvePoint, and I'm Microsoft MVP and Regional Director. And I am joined today by Kirsty McGrath, a fellow Office Apps and Services MVP. Good to have you on board, as well as an adoption specialist and digital transformation specialist with OnPoint Solutions. Good morning, Kirsty.
Good morning. So although it's evening for you there, good morning here in Australia.
It's morning everywhere at all times. I know.
There's always morning somewhere.
It's always in video world. It's always in live stream.
That's
It's morning
it.
somewhere. That's
Yes,
right.
well, I haven't really had an evening because I've been up since 1 a.m. with the Seattle MVP conference. So it's been an all night, really.
Always a lot going on. I know. Well, this is a great topic. It's right up your alley. We're discussing the topic of what does learning look like in the hybrid workspace.
Yeah.
And this is obviously we've all gone through a shared experience here in the world. And so it's been, you and I have had conversations about some of the impacts to the things that we do on a regular basis. And there's things that happen in the office, but specifically what's been happening with organizations and their learning strategies. So let's maybe start things off with what happened to learning as a category during the pandemic.
Look, it was a really interesting space because I have a learning organisation. I teach to a super user level. I've got trainers right around Australia. I've often run both. And I've full-on built virtual learning programs right back even in 2013. I got accredited with the Learning Performance Institute as a certified online learning facilitator. So virtual learning's it's been around for a long time and using lots of different tools apart from Microsoft with being Microsoft MVP. And what we saw was where we would often be doing sort of big programs, and it may be that in person and some of the ways we learn, that all crashed and burned. People weren't really in a learning space with the pandemic. It was just do your job. So where you might have spent time getting to learn a particular product, it was just do. It was on the job experience, hard and fast, and it's sort of back to the learn as you go. And when we do a learn as we go, we often pick up around about 10% of a particular tool or a function, because learning as we go and you look at it, it's challenging. It's a challenging way to do it. And we often don't have time to stop and ask.
Well, the difference also being those that, because that's happened in the past when I've been with companies where training budgets got cut and, downturns in the economy or just the necessity of a project and the timeline and deadlines drove that we charged, but we had each other. We were still all together. And
absolutely.
That's a huge difference though.
But, and the thing is, you may have that. The challenge was the fact that when we go remote, when you're learning by fire, often you might be in an office, for example, so you've got the person you can turn to beside you and ask the question, how do you do this? Okay, so when we were then caught in all this death by meeting with the pandemic, because to try and keep connected, we went into all these meetings to go, well, where are you at? What are you doing? So learning became, the budgets were gone. We saw learning fall over, and I was having a lot of trainers coming to me going, do you have work? Is there something I can do? And where you might have done training that it was a little bit more formal and longer, we were doing really short, sharp webinars. We've got 15 minutes or 30 minutes or 1 hour, rather than spending like I had done a big program going right around Australia. And it was a full 1 day on Microsoft Teams, going right around the organisation, all around Australia to go, because it's a big product. It's not a small product, Microsoft Teams. However, all of a sudden we're doing 30-minute, 1 hour just for the whole business. Bang, that's it, done. Okay, so you look at the learning and what that looks like as a frame. It had a huge impact, and we're only just starting to see some of a little bit of it going back, but we saw a lot more of that difference between the synchronous and the asynchronous type learning. And what did that actually look like around synchronous and asynchronous? So the synchronous, where it's occurring at the same time in the same place, and we're all together on to do one course. And whether it's online or in person, that's kind of in the synchronous side of things. And then when we go to the asynchronous, it's when you start different times, different places. So it's pulling on videos and e-learning and, LinkedIn learning or whatever it looks like. It's designed more for the self-study. So we saw a lot more of go out, you need to just read and watch this, and we're going to record this 1 hour session, go and watch it whenever you like. So we saw this real shift to the learner having to pull the information rather than kind of having there's that push-pull of learning.
Right.
So we've seen some real challenges across that space because we know that in the learning space that when it comes to the asynchronous, approximately around about 26%, sometimes an awful lot lower, will actually do the self-learning and go and find things. And it's probably it's a bit way less than a quarter, but we find that the intention of it isn't captured. We learn, as you said, often on the job by fire through other people.
It's interesting in looking at this, and I think it's a great indication of where hybrid organizations are going. And we hear a lot of talk about the hybrid organization. I mean, and we've been, of course, working with organizations that have been temporarily in that state. But I think I personally feel that I always use the example of and I'm sorry if I've used it before in one of these recordings, but in one of these sessions. For a year of my life, early in my tech experience, I commuted every day on a motorcycle. California weather, it was nice, pleasant, so it wasn't so bad. A few rainstorms that caught me, and I had like the jumpsuit there.
On those roads, though, because everyone likes to do their own speed. Yeah.
Right, but what was nice, and I had a nice short commute there, and so it was very convenient to be on a motorcycle. And I ended my time on a motorcycle by it was parked overnight, and somebody crushed it with their vehicle. I hope that it damaged severely their vehicle because they didn't leave a note. Destroyed my bike. Anyway, I went and bought another car and never went back to that. But what I observed afterwards was how aware I was of other cyclists out on the road. In a car, I would give more space. I would see them where that's one of the biggest problems that with cyclists is they're just not seen by typical drivers. So taking that story and thinking about the hybrid organization, whether or not organizations go back to some semblance of normal, whatever that is, back to in-person working together, teams in offices and cubicles and in those spaces.
It's interesting you bring that up.
But I think that whether or not that happens, I believe that people will retain some of what they learned. Everybody is more aware of motorcycles on the road together because we all had that shared experience. I don't know if you see it the same way about hybrid organizations.
Literally just yesterday, it was supposed to be an in-person, it was senior leadership. CEO, all the senior leaders, they needed to come together. They needed their hands-on. They really wanted their hands-on because it was such core critical learning that they had to do. And when you've got to do full-on physical exercise, core critical, be able to walk around and make sure that they're actually absorbing the information in formal learning. And we'll come back to the 7-20-10 kind of rule of the formal side of the 10%. So I'm in the 10% of the learning and the formal learning. Walking around, yet one person had been hit with, COVID. Another one had been near a positive contact. Someone didn't even realize because there was a Teams link actually in the meeting, even though it said in person. They assumed based on the Teams link in the meeting that it was actually going to be virtual. So 1 minute we've got an in-person, bang, literally 5 minutes before we're setting everything up and we are going hybrid for learning. Now, I've been doing hybrid for a while and it's challenging. It's challenging as an instructor to run hybrid because someone kind of can lose out because you've got the in-person where you're kind of walking around and catering to in the room. And then you've got really good I suppose that Teams room video functionality where you can still see the instructor and you can still engage with your audience rather than sitting in front of a PC. Because if I'm running it from my office, I have to be sitting kind of in front of my PC. But if I'm walking around a room and I'm going hybrid, so we're talking the hybrid learning, a very different experience where a lot of times my assumption has to then be, is the person on the line actually doing the exercises and getting it right? Or always taking note of that person that is online and asking them, how are you going? So I have to not only pitch it to the room, I have to stop and have extra time to pitch it to online. So you've got to have more time to run a hybrid, and often people don't have more time.
It seemed like overkill, but I had an experience in helping run for the last 2 years the North American Collaboration Summit, which takes place in Branson, Missouri. And if anybody's interested in going, it's happening again this year. But but I helped run the hybrid part of it. One of the things that we did was we made sure that every session that there was somebody there in person. And so of course, even as you're presenting, as you're the instructor, the proctor, it's difficult to
The
focus on
moderator.
all those things. And even to have help in the room is great. But
Yeah.
at the minimum, we needed to have moderators online whose role was to
Yeah.
make sure that, and where it worked the best was where there was the instructor leading the session, there was the online, and you had a room full of students as well as the people online, but there was a moderator in the room and online, and they would communicate.
Do you know what the
That
hard part
that
about
was
that?
ideal.
The hard part about that is organisations don't want to pay for 2 trainers.
Correct. Right.
So, you know, we're struggling to get them to make learning efficient. We're struggling to get them to actually consider learning in the new environment where they're wanting to just, and people learn so very differently. When we look at the different types of learners, the visual spatial learner, who's that, the audio, the hearing, and then there's the visual, then there's the tactile, then there's, there's so many different types of learning styles and catering, let alone those around accessibility. So when we say, if we've got a really big room full of people and there's 30 people, we go, we need 2 instructors, one who's up the front, one who's walking around. They'll often go, okay, if we push it, they might kind of, but you go to an online, we need online. Sometimes what they'll do is they might bring someone in internally that's the good knowledge base that might do it. However, why then would you have an external instructor running if you've got someone internal to support? So,
well, this is one of those scenarios, though, what you talk about. So, look, are you asking me what's the most effective, the way that it works the best, where people are able to focus and not have to worry about, am I being heard or not, and not being seen and viewed? Right.
Yeah.
So right. So that's just the reality is that's always been the case, though. It's like, look, here's what we recommend, and there's reasons why we recommend this of doing this. Look, for some of the sessions that we ran, we couldn't always find moderators for both, but we found where it was the most successful was when we had a moderator in the room, a moderator online, and the instructor could then focus on their content and providing that.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the technology to enable that.
So then, when we have a look at it and we look at that, I'm talking that 10%. We've got the 10%, which is the formal learning, which is where I spend a lot of space. But I also spend a lot of time in what's the 70 and the 20 rule. So when we look at the 70 and the 20 rule, it's that whole learning by doing on the job. So the 70% is on the job. Okay, 20% is about people and actually working with people. Now, I've watched a lot of new starters and helped build a lot of orientation programs and things like that. For example, is what does it look like for someone to come in as part of their learning and using this sort of the tech and that the culture of learning or the culture of performance. Really, it's, there's the learning, there's the performance side, and they're kind of all very intertwined. You can't do learning without performance because learning on its own is not going to get you performing necessarily. So you've got to have the kind of the two. So when we look at that 7-20-10 rule, and I take it even from my own daughter who started for the first time in a very, very long time, a mum who started a brand new job, fully virtual for an organization, brand new starter, hasn't worked for, I would say 6 years, I think it was. So for her, real challenge as to on the job learning. When we start to have a look at that, to the 70%, and how can we make it with the on-the-job learning, and who can you call on? And it was like, do you have something like Microsoft Teams where you've got a history of information and information you can pull and you can search and you can find and you can, because if you're not sitting there in the office with all of those tools directly in your hands and people to turn to for the 20%, because the 20% with the working with the people is such an enabler for the 70% of on the job, because we can get a lot wrong on the 70% because if we don't have someone that's guiding us. So that was a core issue where often there was a lot of people to call on because it was all online, but didn't know necessarily who to call for all the different topics, because there's so many things that come up in your 70%. Well, who do I talk to, and being very left alone. Now, we saw that happen in person. I'm not saying it doesn't happen in this new pandemic and the hybrid, how many people have literally just said job by fire, where you dumped in and who do you I don't know who to talk to, who do I talk to? And it's just like, I've got to do, what am I, hang on, hammering a nail, is this the right hammer, is this, so it hasn't changed in some respects, but we've made it just that little bit more challenging, because at least you could eventually walk around and maybe find the supervisor or find someone, or
ask the
now.
question. And right, yeah. So
Yeah.
you just need to be much more prescriptive. And I mean, when you have that formal learning, you always want to be organized. You want people, it should be clear. What are we trying to accomplish? Here's the materials. Here's what I need to go through. Here are the expectations for doing this. And in some internal training programs, it could even be that look, there's there's testing, there's certification, as whatever the class, the learning program that you're going through. But you want it to be that organized. It's especially, to your point, you need to make sure that those contacts, if I have questions, if I'm going at my own speed, or if we're all in an online class at the same speed in a synchronous model together, in either way, like, what is the right way to provide feedback? Where do I ask questions? What's the response time going to be?
It has to be very structured, and you have to be really clear around that for your organization and for new starters. And a good buddy program, for example, what does a good buddy mentoring graduate programs look like? We've seen them, a lot of the times. It's no different for a new starter, and there's been a bit of a gap. So you've got to have lots of sort of alternative digital strategies that are actually going on. You've got to be able to adapt to different delivery modes, whether it's online and in person, and potentially hybrid, and have the people with the right skills to be able to enable that, whatever it is on the journey on the 7-20-10 in terms of that sort of learning theory. We need to also protect some of that in-person component, because there are some core things that you just need to do in person. And when do you do that? What does it look like? How do you engage? And try and be really clear around when is it in person and when is it hybrid. Unlike yesterday, where it all got so confused. I don't know, am I supposed to be in person? Is it supposed to be? So if there's confusion, people don't know, and then they feel like they're missing out on something. So, clear on that one becomes just so important, having just had it happen to me just yesterday. But that portfolio of lots of different learning options can be costly and time consuming, but it can also be really cheap and really quick if you do it right. There's a lot of pre-built content that's actually out there that can be dropped in and utilized. Another really good one is Microsoft have got some great sort of in-app sort of things where it's gamification, and even asking questions around the learning. It could be this game of how do you find, or where do you find, even for orientations or new starters, or maybe it's a job shift, and supporting senior leaders when it comes to learning, and making sure that they understand it's such a vital component. We're seeing learning really getting missed when people are under stress and pressure. They find it very hard to learn. I saw it. I was looking after the Microsoft Teams for Education sort of on Facebook, and teachers were so overwhelmed turning into this new tech, of which they had a 1-hour session maybe with their support person who didn't know much about Teams in the first place. So they then, of course, absolutely pummeled all of the forums, and the same questions were asked literally again and again. I had a big sheet where it's a copy and paste of what to do in a screenshot. And it was just, they weren't even searching in the forums to go, has this been answered? They just went, just tell me. So what does your just in time actually look like on the, do you have a bot, for example?
That's an important aspect of any, long term, whether or not, you maintain a hybrid, if we go move back into, but creating that culture of learning. An important part of that is, like, you have to build that knowledge base up. You have to have it structured. You have to direct those people back. Look, you need to go search for these. We've provided these answers. I mean, I understand when somebody's new coming into an organization, where I've had this experience where I didn't know where to go and search to find those answers, to find in that knowledge base. I wish that search were such that I could search in one place and find across all of these data silos, these information silos. That's still not the reality. That's not the world we live in yet.
certainly much better. It's much better than where we used to be. I mean, back in the day when I was sort of first starting, it was the typewriter and the telex and you didn't have those online to really search. There might have been a book there that you could flick through if someone had actually.
It was all, I come from the world of 3-ring binders as well. That was with the process of documentation.
So, we've come a long way in terms of, but back then was very formal, like orientation day kind of things. Right. And, so we had ways of learning that I think we shouldn't let go of, that we can still do in a virtual way and make sure that it's actually documented and that we've got a really good learning program. We've got and I see it all the time where I'll be rolling out and doing programs around Office 365, Microsoft 365, what's good communication, good collaboration. And I go, great, I have taught the change champions. Now you're taking that out into the business. But what about the new starters? Because the new starters, if they're in a buddy system and they get married up with someone who's still working in the old way of work, very quickly, if you've got a turnover of 50% of your organization in the space on average of over 3 years, you have a 50% turnover. What does that look like? Is it taking you back in your digital strategy or is it taking you forward in your digital strategy of learning? Because they're all parts and components of being a good learning performance organization.
So what does this look like long term? I mean, are we in another transitory state of, moving back from hybrid back into the way that it was? Are we in a permanent hybrid state? I mean, what does learning look like going forward? Like all I'm asking is for you to lay out your exact predictions, and we'll come back in like a year and find out if you were right.
Yeah. Okay. Look, what I found was, and to give you a bit of an idea, we went through a very similar process years ago, somewhat different, but it used to be that when we were upgrading to Office, for example, we had Office for 3 years. Okay, so it was just all you needed to do was what's new. So we went from doing longer term training where it was sort of in person to these quick 1 hour seminars that would be really hard and fast, webinar, seminar. So it was just short, sharp knowledge. And we're seeing a lot of short, sharp knowledge. It started to turn around. So 2 years ago, before the pandemic, we had about 2 years where it got hardcore, more hands-on, longer sessions to learn, because we realized that, that hands-on to shift the way that we work in behavior, like to truly shift some of the work in behavior. Pandemic kind of put a bit of a fire under it, but we found that nothing beat that hands-on component. And I'm seeing organizations putting off, going, no, we want to put this off because it needs to be hands-on. We need to put it off. We need to put it off. We need to put it off. So they know when they're hands-on. And I think we're going to see more and more of it come back in, just because nothing beats having someone standing over you and going, no, you're clicking on the wrong, and not losing them, because we have in online, around about a 2 to 3 minute attention span. So, we lose it. When you're in a classroom and you've got an instructor in front of you and they can see what you're doing, they're forced to do a different type of learning. So I'm going to see that, in 2 years, we're going to see more and more back in person, drawing people back in, those workshops in person. It's going to eventually turn back around. There will be components we'll always do in a virtual and a webinar.
Like for example, like with all the Microsoft 365 components, Microsoft has spent a lot of expense and time building out hands-on lab modules, things that you can go and plug in to do, which can be self-driven. You can set that up and be, instructor-driven around those things. But it's, I mean, won't we see then a mixture of those things? I mean, because some things I've been through. Look, I love having, in some cases, having that classroom setting to be able to ask questions, to interact with peers around something. But for a lot of, especially technology-related learning, I just want to go at my own speed and want to go through it. I understand that the organization might want to measure my progress, track my retention of what I'm learning. And there are certainly tools and gamification and surveys and tests that can be done to check my knowledge of what I'm learning, to make sure that I'm moving, progressing forward in the program. But so aren't we going to see a blend of those things?
Yeah, absolutely. So the 2 points that you've made there is, if I do that prediction of what it was, it got to the point where it was 70% in person, 30% online. We're going to see more 70% online, 30% in person. There's still going to be a lot of core stuff, and it depends on your role. Because a frontline worker, it is hands-on. It's still it's still more than 30% potentially online. A lot of them aren't overly tech savvy, so it's always going to be more in person. So that caveat is always around what's their role. And that's very different to the office worker who's working in this kind of an environment where it's a bit more hybrid type thing. So two different ways. So you'll definitely have that. Then there's the manager making sure that they have time in people's diaries, very specifically around learning and regular learning. For, even just I'll have an organization go, yes, we're using Teams. Okay, so they say, yes, we're using Microsoft Teams. And all they're really doing is chat and kicking off meetings. They are not using Microsoft Teams. So that to get learning on that's going to take time. And to take time, they're going to have to make sure that it's actually pushed out, and senior leaders are enforcing more learning, because when we've seen learning take a big back burner to just getting their job done under stress and pressure. People don't absorb and often don't go out and necessarily learn when they're under that kind of pressure. It's starting to come around now. We're starting to see it where people go, I can take a bit of a breath now. I'm not in panic mode, or sick, for example, or dealing with trauma, or dealing with, because there was a lot of trauma, and there's still a lot of trauma going on, across Australia. We got flooding right down the board. We had fires, we've had, pandemics, we've had so many things. So when people are in those kind of stress responses, learning goes out the window. So we have to have a look now as what do the programs look like, and be compassionate about it, making sure we've got good hybrid, both an instructor, if it's going to be in person, if it's going to be hybrid, have someone as a moderator or online to support them. Good digital programs, good orientation, good some great strategies in place to support this new hybrid of work. And I'm still not seeing a lot of it out there yet.
Well, one last thing I would add to that is that, for organizations that are looking at it, it's like, don't cut the training budgets now, especially now. I said it's going to be even more critical. One thing I've noticed is that when people for extended periods, work remotely, then they kind of drift back into bad habits. And so having a refresher course on, especially if you work in an industry where you're, with your information architecture is very critical to the way that you collaborate. You have strong, strict compliance and regulatory requirements in the way that people work. It's always good to have a refresher on those things and those kinds of regulated industries as well. So there's always learning to be done out there.
Always learning to be done. So stop, think, have a look at what you've got as a performance organization, and start to focus on it. And productivity and some of those hints and tips are even more important than they ever were.
Yep. Well, Kirsty, really appreciate you joining me this morning, and let me know how things go as things open up. We'll have to come back and talk about this. I was joking before, but we really should track as things get out of the pandemic. We should come back and look at this again on this specific topic, a year from now. Let's do it again.
Yeah, been absolutely watching it very closely. It's an interesting space. There's a lot of great research that's coming out.
There's a ton that's happening in the space in the EDU, especially within Microsoft 365. Yeah. And for those that are watching, thank you so much for joining us today. If you have not already done so, please subscribe to the Office 365 Hours. You'll get notifications. We won't spam you. You just get notifications about our upcoming shows, which are on the first and third Wednesday morning Eastern U.S. time, Wednesday mornings. So what is that? Late or early the Thursday mornings by the time it shows up in your inbox there, Kirsty. But it's always at 11 a.m. Eastern. And for those that joined us, thanks for watching.
Thank you.